Are you multitasking with everyone's been able to I'm glad everyone has been able to join us today. It's really a pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Chris Widga to our meeting today. Dr. Widga received his baccalaureate degree in anthropology at the University of Nebraska, and then went on to get master's and PhD degrees at the University of Kansas. So he was really lucky enough to be able to do his educational work in a really wonderful fossiliferous part of the country, which I think we all hope to be able to visit one day and explore. Chris is now with the Gray Fossil Site, a museum at the East Tennessee State University. And that may sound familiar to many of you because our own Emily has been a representative of that site and museum and university to us before. And Dr. Widga was her thesis advisor. So we're doubly excited to have him here today. He is to us today about North American mammoths, which is a subject that's really close to my heart. He has a real interest in studying the paleoecology and the megafauna of North America. And so it's quite exciting to have some kind of local interest brought to our membership today. So without further ado, Dr. Widga, I will ask you to please take over and continue on with your presentation.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for having me today. I love talking to groups like this because you guys are the ones that have like your eyes on the ground. I'm the one that comes along 100 years later and looks at the bones in a museum. But yeah, so this is I really enjoy giving talks like this. Yeah, so I'm from Nebraska and I grew up on the Great Plains. Most of my work throughout my career has been in museums, and it's been in kind of these local and regional museums where your research really focuses on what's going on in your backyard. And that has really been fun because it's really driven some of my interests in the direction of things like mammoths and mastodons, because you'll see they are everywhere. And so probably maybe some of you have even found some. I know we've poked around a little bit in North Carolina, even before I moved down to East Tennessee. Let's see, am I muted?
I'm sorry, Chris. I muted you.
That's fine.
Instead of muting me.
Okay.
I apologize.
Good. Everybody can hear me okay though, right?
Yes, they can now.
Okay.
Please go ahead. Sorry.
So yeah, it's very much fun to come to you today, not from Johnson City, I might add. I'm at my in-laws' house in Greensboro, so I'm in their upper room, and I thought this would be an appropriate place to give a talk on mammoths and mastodons of the Southeast. But I'll see if I can share my screen, and we'll get going here. So one of the things, I'm going to shrink this a little bit so I can actually see what I'm doing. And maybe I won't. One of the things that
on the black screen.
All you see is a black screen?
Yeah, it says you started sharing, but it hasn't started yet.
Okay. Let's see, that'll give me a chance to find my spotlight. All right. Can you see it? Is it there yet?
No.
No, not yet. Let's see here. Maybe I will try. Oh, some of you are coming back. That's
there
good.
It is. Thank you. That's
all right. Good. I see Jim Mickle just entered the room. That's
I'll take care of all those.
All right. So when you guys kind of asked me to give a talk many months ago. I think it was just after there was a big article that came out in Nature on some of the earliest DNA of that had been recovered from permafrost sediments in Siberia, and it had been mammoth DNA, and it was about 1.5 million years old. So or it was over 1 million years. So it was very old mammoth DNA. And when you guys asked what I would like to talk about, that was on my mind, as was the idea of, kind of talking a little bit more generally about some of the extinct elephants that we had in the Southeast. And so this was the title I came up with. As I started pulling things together, I admit it's not all about mammoths. In fact, it's all about mammoths. It's mostly about mastodons, because that's the record that we have from the eastern US. I'm gonna try and hide some things here so I can see what I'm doing. So today what I'll do is I'll kind of talk about the kind of this regional record of extinct elephants that we have. Most of those are going to be mastodons, but some of them are also going to be some other groups of elephants that are from the eastern U.S. I'm kind of using elephants in a broad sense rather than a specific taxonomic sense. But if we look at, well, let's see if we can advance, maybe. Zoom is not liking us today. Are we just slow? There we go. Okay. So if we look at the southeastern US, one of the things I kind of want to emphasize today is just the broad diversity of ecosystems that we have in this part of the continent. And this is something that, coming from Kansas and Nebraska and doing a lot of my early training and early work in the Great Plains, this was new to me. I seem to keep moving further and further east, where it gets moister and moister and moister. And so, everything from in the Southeast, we've got so much precipitation and we've got so much biodiversity that we have just a huge array of landscapes that are available. And they're not only available today, but they were available in the past as well. So, up where we are at, we've got the Appalachian Mountains. We've got, I think this is the Mid-Atlantic seaboard. No, that's Gulf Coastal Plain. I actually chose these for a reason. This is
Chris,
Calvert.
you're still not seeing your, there they just advanced. Thank you.
Oh, wow. It is a little bit delayed. Hopefully it'll
There's
catch
a lag
up.
there. Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So we've got Appalachian Mountains, we've got Gulf Coastal Plain. This is the Calvert Cliffs in Maryland. These are landscapes that a lot of you are very familiar with. These are landscapes that we can go and we can visit them today. One of the cool things about being a paleontologist is that we kind of see landscapes a little bit differently. We're thinking about how the animals that we study actually would have lived in these landscapes, and if these landscapes aren't the same, or if they're different than what they were in the past, then we're also trying to do that. Oh boy. Okay. This is a map of mammoths and mastodons in the United States in general. So I'm part of a big database consortium that is called the Neotoma database. And this is tracking, I'm gonna try and bring up some things here so I can keep an eye on our presentation. But this is a big database that basically is kind of tracking animals and plants throughout the Quaternary, so throughout the last 2.5 million years. But then we've started expanding back. And so in this case, the green dots, they're pretty big dots because of the screen grab, but green dots are mammoths and the red dots are mastodons. So you can see that a lot of mastodons in the eastern US, and they're really focused kind of here in the Great Lakes and in the Midwest, but they do kind of move down into the Southeast. And so if we were going to really look at what the most common proboscidean or the most common elephant that we had in the southeastern US, it would be hands down mastodons. So when we look at, as a paleontologist, I've tried to advance. Paleontologist, when I look at these landscapes that I just showed you, and I'm going to show you again as soon as the slide advances. Hmm. There we go. So when I look at these landscapes from a perspective of a person who thinks about elephants and thinks about extinct proboscideans, really what I'm seeing is something like this. You know, we're basically looking at representative forms that occur in all these different environments. So whether it's the Calvert Cliffs in Maryland, whether it's the Gulf Coastal Plain, whether it's the lower Mississippi Valley or the Appalachian Mountains, we're basically kind of able to say, okay, we've got mammoths from all these different places. How are they different? We've got mastodons from all these different places. How are they different? Or do they appear at different times? Do they appear in different ecological niches? This is really what makes looking at elephants in this region really interesting. So this is kind of what I'm going to talk about today. It's going to be mostly touching on a lot of the research that we're doing here at ETSU and some of my students have been doing, including Emily, and we're kind of picking and focusing on some particular localities and paleontological records in different parts of the Southeast that we're trying to understand these animals at a more regional scale. Advance. There we go. So backing up a little bit, in North America, we had three major groups of proboscideans. So proboscideans are the order that includes modern elephants. They're proboscidean because they have a long proboscis, a trunk. And we have these three groups. One was mastodons. So, but a lot of us have heard of mastodons. One of those groups is mammoths. One of those groups is Gomphotheres. Gomphotheres are kind of the poor unknown cousin to mammoths and mastodons, but mammoths get all the love. And so I don't feel a bit bad about really focusing on some of these other groups today because the mammoths really get a lot of attention. Let's see, moving ahead, but they don't all get here at the same time. So this is a paper from years ago, but it's been borne out by some more recent ancient DNA work. This was looking at some of the earliest mastodon DNA that was actually recovered from the Yukon. We've had mammoth DNA for many years. And in fact, some of the first ancient DNA that came out was from mammoths that had appeared in Alaska and in the Arctic. But what you can see, since we've got the ancient DNA, we can get a pretty decent split dates for this phylogeny, for this phylogenetic tree. So Americanum, which is the American mastodon over here, and it splits off of the main line of proboscideans about 25 million years ago. So very early. And then mammoths kind of keep going. Elephants, in terms of the family Elephantidae, so modern African elephants and Asian elephants and woolly mammoths and those sorts of things. They kind of follow this main trunk of elephant evolution and leave Africa, evolve in Africa, and then leave Africa about 5 million years ago. When they get to North America, is totally different. So mastodons and Gomphotheres get here about 16.5 million years ago. The first records of proboscideans in North America are actually not bones. They are footprints. So in California, we've got some records of things like from a canyon aptly called Gomphothere Canyon, that is a late Hemphillian, late Hemingfordian, so about 16 million year old trackway of elephant feet. We can't really tell if it's a mastodon or a Gomphothere, and we know mammoths weren't around yet, so we know it wasn't a mammoth, but we can't tell whether these trackways were from mastodons or from Gomphotheres. Shortly after that, we've got teeth in the record, and so we can tease apart mastodons and Gomphotheres pretty quickly. But then mammoths don't get here until much later, only about 1.5 million years ago. So they are truly an ice age kind of colonizer. If I want to talk a little bit about these early mastodons in North America, the record becomes very interesting very quickly, and you really have to zoom out to the continental scale. And so this is a snapshot from some work that we've got in press with the Oregon Museum of Natural History. But this is just where we have early mastodons in North America. So pre-Quaternary, pre-Ice Age mastodons. And so a lot of them are Great Plains, a lot of them are in the West. And you'll notice up here, we've got our land mammal ages. And so Hemingfordian, we've only got one locality where we've got Hemingfordian mastodons, and that's at Massacre Lake up in northwestern Nevada. We've got a couple of other things going on in Oregon, but it's really dominated by these earlier deposits that are further out west. And so one of the big things that we've been working on lately is trying to track down all these specimens in the museums where they're at, get good pictures, get good descriptions, and try and make sense of them. Basically, nobody's really worked on the taxonomy of mastodons for about 100 years, since Henry Fairfield Osborn wrote them up in his big 2-volume set of Proboscidea. But this is a work that is long time coming. So you can kind of see that there's a lot of stuff in the central US and the eastern US. You'll see kind of this pattern again when we start talking about gray. But over here, you see gray fossil site in northeastern Tennessee, and you see a bunch of sites in Florida. And this is really our primary eastern US record of early mastodons. And the Florida record was really it until we had gray a couple of years ago. So I'm going to kind of start out talking a little bit about the gray mastodon that we've been working on for the last couple of years. Gray itself was discovered in 2000, so it's a fairly young site. The wonderful thing about that is that it's in the digital age. So basically from day one, we've had digital databases. We've been mapping things in with technical grade, digital surveying equipment, that sort of thing. In recent years, we've really moved into 3D scanning and printing. And I'll show you some really kind of cool things that are happening with this. And in fact, it's gotten integrated into our preparation. So some of these bits and pieces that we're putting back onto mastodon bones that you're seeing on these tables are actually 3D printed butte bar. So it's something that one of the shelf stable archival glues that we often use to prepare vertebrate fossils is this substance called polyvinyl butyrol, and it's used everywhere. And we discovered, since the company that makes it is Eastman Chemical, which is just down the road for us, and they said, well, we also make this in a 3D printable filament. So we're able to actually, you will see a couple of pictures of the skull down the road, and we're able to print out bits and pieces that we can actually mirror parts of the skull and integrate it into the prep. It's kind of fun. But in general, this is a 4.5 acre, basically a 5 million year old sinkhole filled deposit. 5 million years old, we had a sinkhole in northeastern Tennessee, slowly filled, and as it filled, there were also animals that died there and were preserved there. Since 2000, we've cataloged over 30,000 objects. These are primarily vertebrate fossils, but there's also a very rich plant record. We've documented algal spores. We've got fungi. We've got all kinds of. It's basically a snapshot of a sinkhole ecosystem 5 million years ago. Like I said, we kind of have been mapping things since 2000, and this is starting to kind of play out as we see things like virtual reality come of age. We're able to create environments that include all of our mapped fossils. So I've been able to do things like fly through our site because we've got data for all of our, we can kind of reconstruct the site with. And then, like I said, we're kind of experimenting, constantly trying to move the needle in terms of how we document these things, whether it's 2D, whether it's 3-dimensional, or whether it's even 4-dimensional. So just this last year, we were able to get funding for a micro CT lab at ETSU. So that is what we would call 4 dimensions. So we're able to scan things and look at not only the outer surface, but also the inside surfaces. This is really a site where we have a lot of active and ongoing research. So we have 4 paleontologists that are on the faculty at ETSU. We have a graduate program in vertebrate paleontology. So many of you know Emily, and Emily's gone through this program. And then we've also got this wonderful museum that's basically built on top of the fossil site. So this is where my and we're able to think about, basically 24/7. We're not just thinking about it for 6 weeks during the summer, we're thinking about it all the time. So how did the gray fossil site form? It's basically a Pliocene sinkhole collapse feature in Ordovician limestone. So we kind of have a series of images here where we've got this Ordovician limestone, and this is the Knox group formation. So it's very widespread in this part of the world. And we had a collapse feature within that Knox group limestone that was then flooded, and then it slowly fills in. And so the edges of the sinkhole could be really dynamic. And we see this in some of the sediment cores that we have out of the sinkhole, where you'll have one side basically cave in, and it'll destabilize the other side, and it'll cave in again. And what we think is a window of about 10,000 years is what it took to basically fill up this sinkhole. And so during that time, we had a lot of animals entering the sinkhole. These animals have helped to date the site. So right now we've got a biochronology that's built on about 24 different taxa. So here's some of those taxa, everything from Teleoceras, so the stout-legged rhino, which in our case is kind of long-limbed, some badger and short-faced bear, water moles. So there's a lot of these different species that we kind of look at how they overlap in time between their first appearance dates and their last appearance dates, and see, when our best estimate is for how old this deposit is. And so our best estimate is about 4.7 to 4.9 million years ago. This puts it at the very tail end of the Hemphillian land mammal age and the very beginning of the Pliocene. So we're at a very dynamic period in kind of the ecological history of the eastern U.S. This is one of the youngest deposits that has things like Teleoceras. But then we've also got some things that are coming in that are more Pliocene in age. So, things like Neotoma, we've got early records of that. We've got records of the earliest representatives of Gulo, the genus that is the wolverine. So, and it's the only wolverine record that is not boreal at this point. So this was described a couple of years ago by Josh Samuels, and he basically said they called it Gulo sudorius, so the sweaty wolverine, because it's not something that it's a wolverine that's here in this warmer environment, not in a boreal environment. So some of the really interesting animals here, we don't see elsewhere during the Miocene or during the Pliocene. So if you look at this map, this yellow strip is basically where we see a lot of Miopliocene sites. There's some stuff in Florida, and then you've got some Gulf Coast material, and then the bulk of sites are, like you saw with that mastodon map that I showed you, a lot of things from the central US and then the western US. And gray fossil site stands out as something geographically different. And this really fits with the kind of animals that we're getting from the gray fossil site, because they are unique. We're getting things like red pandas. This is one of 2 localities where we get red pandas in North America. And it is the best red panda locality in North America because we've got multiple complete skeletons. The only other locality is a single tooth in Washington State. We've got things like beaded lizards. This is a relative of the Gila monster. So some fun things like that. The other cool animal that's kind of come out in recent years is giant flying squirrels. So not just flying squirrels, but giant flying squirrels. Giant flying squirrels we have elsewhere in Florida during about the same time. But the cool thing is that the fossil genus is the same genus as the modern flying squirrel. So here's just a screen grab of a giant flying squirrel from Southeast Asia today. These are house cat sized flying squirrels. They're really cool. I encourage you to look at YouTube videos of these things. It's like a cat flying off of a tree limb. But given all these different animals, they tend to all be forest dwellers. So there's kind of been a back and forth through time, through the last 20 years, of what is the gray fossil site. Is it this drier environment like most of the Miocene? Is it opening up a closed forest because of decreased precipitation? Is there a seasonal fire regime? Is there seasonal precipitation where there's a strong monsoon? A lot of these are still kind of open questions, but given the vertebrate fauna, basically what we're seeing is a very close canopied forest. We're not seeing a lot of fire, and we're seeing it very, very moist and not super warm, but perhaps a bit warmer than modern. So these are all kind of active research questions that we're still kind of working on. But there are some really high points to gray, and I'm going to kind of use this as a jumping off point to start talking about the mastodon. But these are the if we were going to look at kind of the 4 species, vertebrate fauna species that really are striking, we would have turtles. So turtles are everywhere. And so there's actually a new species of slider turtle called Trachomis hogradi, named after our preparator. And we've got dozens of Trachomis. We have hundreds, well, over 100 dwarf tapir fossils, or not just fossils. We have thousands of fossils, but over 100 individuals. And so if we were going to name the site after, the animals that are the most common in the site, it would be the tortoise and tapir site, because we've just got bigger samples of those than anywhere else. But we've also got some of these really interesting rhinos. This is Teleoceras for sure, but our particular species of rhino is a new species of rhino that was described by one of our former graduate students a couple of years ago, and it has somewhat longer legs. This species of rhino does occur in Florida as well, but so far we just have this one species. It's the high-bodied rhino, high-bodied, short-bellied rhino, barrel-chested rhino. This is Teleoceras epsoma. And so we've got some very, very complete skeletons of this particular rhino. No horn and very long legs. But then the other thing that has come up and really been the focus in the last couple of years is this mastodon that has been, we've been working on excavating and preparing. And so you can kind of see initially that there are some very big differences between this animal and what kind of our idea of what a mammoth looks like, and even what a mastodon looks like if you're thinking about a mastodon. This is art that has been done by one of our former graduate students, another one of our former graduate students, Matthew Nabinet. And I need to go back, I'm not done yet. Sorry about that. But you can kind of see there's some different shapes to the tusks. This particular animal has some very large chin tusks. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But then it also is different proportionally in different ways. And so we'll get to some of these things in more detail. So talking a little bit more about the mastodon itself. This is what it looks like in the ground. And this has been one of the kind of ongoing areas of research, is trying to understand what really is the taphonomy of this animal. How did it end up in the sinkhole? Why is it so complete? We actually have all the bits and pieces of a full skeleton, with the exception of the left kneecap, which is probably hiding in a jacket somewhere. So there's a complete skeleton. It's in more or less anatomical order. So the front legs are all together, the cranial elements and the axial elements tend to be all together, and that's been kind of one of the interesting things about this as well. This is a shot of the ulna in situ in the field, and you can kind of see this dark gray sediment, and that's where a lot of our really well preserved specimens are. But in this case, we've got some other things going on. So I've highlighted the ulna that's in the field, but we've got these big boulders as well. And there's actually no space in between these boulders and this bone. So they are tightly associated. This is what this looks like, kind of zooming out a little bit. We've got these big boulders around here. Each one of these little blue flags is a fossil. And so it's going to get shot in with our total station. But this is the mastodon pit. And so this is not normal for gray. Most of the time we have kind of a nice fine-grained, dark black lacustrine sediment. In this case, we're dealing with a lot of oxidation. We're dealing with a lot of large boulders. The other cool thing is that we're seeing kind of this leading edge of what might be a rock slide feature. So all of our mastodon material is really occurring in this upper stuff. We're thinking that this is some sort of rapid movement, indicates some sort of rapid movement and maybe some sort of rock slide or mass wasting event. We've got things like chaotic matrix or poorly sorted matrix. And then we've even got some clay beds that appear to be truncated by slide sediment. So, thinking back to what that sinkhole might have looked like, and with these very steep edges, like I said, those edges are very, very dynamic. And so they're able to, they're moving very quickly at sometimes. This is not a record where we have very gradual change very often. But we've known about this particular animal since 2000, since the discovery of the site. At that time, all we had were some ivory chunks. And so this was the initial discovery, was part of the Tennessee Department of Transportation. They were doing some road work, and they were trying to basically remove the hill that the site is in. And as they got down to that black sediment, they started hitting bones, and then they alerted archaeologists and then ultimately paleontologists to this discovery. And so some of these earliest specimens, earliest chunks, were actually ivory chunks. And then in 2015, our field crews actually started chasing down all the ivory chunks that they had mapped through the years. And they followed the ivory chunks one direction, and they found the tip of this tusk. And then they followed them the other direction, and they found the rest of this tusk. This tusk was actually connected to a skull, and that skull was in tight association with a mandible. So this is kind of a mastodon that really kind of grew over time. But in 2000, or in the early years before 2015, the question was, which elephant was it? Remember, we had two that were around at this time. You had Gomphotheres and you had mastodons. And at that time, all we had were tusk fragments. And then there were a couple of foot elements, some toe bones. And these are not diagnostic elements. So the idea was, well, we've got Gomphotheres for the most part in Florida, so maybe this is a Gomphothere. This is a mural that we have on display in our museum done by Karen Card. So she was reconstructing this idea of a Gomphothere at the Great Fossil Site. And so we've got this four-tusker that's stripping bark off a tree, and a couple of peccaries and a baby and a sloth in the background. So this was kind of the early idea, and this was the scenario up until 2015, when we started getting teeth. And so teeth in Gomphotheres and mastodons are really where it's at. That's how you tell the difference between the two. And if we wanted to know what the teeth in this four-tusker looked like, this is what they look like. So these are very large teeth. It's about a foot long, 10 or 11 inches long. And we've got these different lophids going throughout this tooth. And then in this case, these are not open valleys between the two, or between these different lophids. In this case, they've got cusps in between. This is really different from some of the gray fossil site mastodons. This is one that we call the red skull. And you can kind of see that they don't have those little enamel pillars in the middle. And so we knew immediately, once we had teeth, that these were true mastodons or mammut, not Gomphothere. And we kept finding more and more and more. So these are just some screen grabs that I did earlier in the summer of material that was spread out in our prep lab. And so this is all of a front leg here. It's actually both of our front legs. This is that ulna that was in the field that you saw a picture of. Here's its humerus. We've actually got bits and pieces of another humerus over here. And then we've got that humerus, most of it is jacketed up. But we've got a lot of its vertebrae. We just have most of this animal, which means that we can say a lot about it. Actually, I moved that onto here. Oh yeah, we're putting it back together. We're gluing it back together. We're also doing things like 3D scanning it. So this is me doing some 3D scanning earlier in the summer. This is the femur of our mastodon. So this is, like I said, we've invested a lot in 3D scanning with the idea that ultimately these are going to be available online, so anybody can look at them. All these things are mapped in. So this is from a student thesis just this last spring that David Carney did, basically creating a 3D environment that we can kind of navigate through this deposit and better understand how these bones are related to each other. And then what we end up with, and this is kind of a work in progress. So this is a screenshot of what I'm using to reconstruct this animal digitally. So this is in Blender, which is a 3D sculpting program, basically. And we've got 3D scans of our mastodon mandible here. Here's all of its femur or its femora, tibia, fibula are all in the background here. And this is a very early stage, so I'm still dumping a lot of these 3D scans into this digital articulation. But I've kind of put a mock-up of what our animal might have looked like behind here to help me along. Probably has a little bit straighter tusks. One of the really neat things is that since we have its complete long bones, we can actually get a really good estimate of how tall it was and what it weighed. And so we're looking at an animal that's about 10.5 feet tall, which makes it among the tallest mastodons from North America. And we're also looking at something that's probably 9 to 11 tons, which makes it one of the largest mastodons from North America. To kind of put that into perspective, the largest African bush elephant on record was about 10.5 tons. Elephants themselves are much taller, tend to be much taller than mastodons because they have much longer, more slender limbs. And so, mammoths and elephants, they're long, slender limb, they're skinnier. Mastodons often have these big back ends and they just pack on the pounds. And so they can be much, much heavier pound for pound and inch for inch than mammoths and elephants. Some of the cool things that we can do and that we're finding out is that their tusks are different. So in this case, we're dealing with long, fairly straight tusks. They may be turned inward and the tips may be turned downward just a little bit. And this seems to be kind of important in understanding what this animal might be. That certainly does not exist elsewhere in North America that we can tell within this group, within mastodons. The other thing we're seeing is that we have this very long mandible. So mammoths and elephants have a very short mandible. It would be about half the length of this one, basically end right in front of these teeth. In mastodons, there's a little bit more variability. There's probably a lot of more of a kind of genetic variability in this, phenotypic variability. There is a kind of a precedent for lengthening this jaw. But ours seems to be even longer than most. In fact, most elephant paleontologists that I've showed this to, their first impression is, are you sure you don't have a Gomphothere? Because Gomphotheres, they're shovel tuskers, they're four tuskers, they're the ones that usually have these long jaws. But then I show these paleontologists the teeth and they're like, okay, yeah, you've definitely got a mastodon. So this is a longer jaw. It has these massive chin tusks. These chin tusks are about 35, 40 centimeters. So they fit in those sockets. This is a really, really interesting animal. And then one of the last things that it has that's kind of different is these limbs are really long and slender. Mastodons tend to have short, stubby limbs in comparison to elephants and mammoths. But in this case, for instance, this femur looks just like a Columbian mammoth proportionally. Is really kind of crazy. So this is a much taller, more slender mastodon. And at the moment, it is the tallest mastodon in North America in the fossil record. I guess we don't have any mastodons that aren't in the fossil record, but the previous record holder was a very large American mastodon from southwestern Missouri that I used to curate when I was a curator at the Illinois State Museum, so I was very familiar with it. But this one is just a few centimeters larger. So this is kind of to zoom out again and kind of put this back into perspective. Great fossil site mastodon is right here. It's kind of at the border between the Hempylian and the Blancan, the early Pliocene. It's really a large mastodon when you compare it to all the mastodons. This is more art from Matt and Abinet, our former graduate student. And so he basically had constructed all of the mastodon family tree as this profile, to the point of having American mastodon and then Pacific mastodon, which was just described a couple of years ago from the West Coast. and this is really kind of a linchpin. We're dealing with a time period when mastodons were really getting bigger. Their tusks were changing, their diets were changing, probably how they utilized the landscape was changing. And we're also dealing with a time period of very different climate change. And so this kind of transitions us into a discussion of what's going on during the Pleistocene, so during the Ice Age. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in the Southeast during the Ice Age. This is something that before coming to Tennessee, I really hadn't worked much at all in the Pliocene. Most of my work had been during the Ice Age in the Pleistocene. And so this is kind of near and dear to me. It's very familiar to me, except one of the cool things is when I was a curator in Illinois, we were always thinking about where was the ice at a certain time period. And so we were dating our fossils and trying to understand, what the local environment would have been in relationship to these giant ice sheets that were covering North America. But in the Southeast, we don't have that. We have some things going on along the Appalachians that, it's certainly much colder. In fact, there is some records of what are called periglacial environments, or some people have called them periglacial environments, basically perennially frozen ground. So a frozen ground that does not thaw out during the summer. So you end up with frozen ground features like boulder trains and that sort of thing, which is really neat. And we'll talk a little bit about those down in a couple of slides. But we're thinking about the Ice Age in kind of a very different way than you are when you are closer to those glaciers. This is in the Southeast in general, we were dealing with an expansion of this spruce fir zone. This is a zone that we now see at Mount Mitchell exclusively, but during the Ice Age, it had come down much lower, and it's also coming down latitudinally further south. And so we've got some really good spruce records all the way as far south as South Carolina. And then one of the cool things, this is some of my recent work and kind of the reviews that I've written, but Florida seems to be doing something totally different. There was a lot more shelf during Florida because we had a lower sea level, but also Florida does not get colder when the rest of the continent gets colder. It does not get warmer when the rest of the continent gets warmer because it's kind of being heated and cooled by a different current here. So Florida kind of goes its own way. That kind of suggests to me that, well, my approach has always been, I don't want I enjoy doing work in places where we're learning new things. And a lot of times that's been in my own backyard. Florida has been a place where they've had a strong paleontology program for many, 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 many years. And so we know a lot about Florida already. So I've tended to say, okay, Florida, we already know what's going on there. Let's figure out what's going on elsewhere. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Here's the Ice Age record of mammoths and mastodons in the Southeast. I will say this is not comprehensive. So Mississippi and Alabama look to be basically not have any mammoths and mastodons in them. And that is absolutely not true. It's just that we haven't updated the database yet. But you can see we still have quite a bit of variability here. North Carolina, we need to add more. So I'm hoping to be able to add more to this database from the North Carolina State Museum and their collections. And one of the projects that we really want to move forward with in the next couple of years is redating a lot of these things. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So just to kind of give you some of the things that we've been working on lately, this is actually an interglacial mastodon. And I'm starting there because it's older than what we tend to think of as the height of the Ice Age. So the last interglacial is about 75 to 115, 120,000 years ago, and it's warmer. So sea level is higher. You're dealing with these different beaches along the Atlantic coast that correspond to different time periods. And this particular mastodon has a wonderfully interesting historical story. It was discovered in the 1860s by a captain of one of the coastal mapping crews, and it was eroding out of the beach at St. Helena Island in South Carolina. And so this is a really interesting animal. It was found and it was purchased by Amherst College. So they have a natural history museum called the Benesky Museum. This is up in Massachusetts, and it's an early mount of mastodons, and it's a beautiful mastodon. It's really big, number one, Another really interesting aspect of it are these big chin tusks. So remember I talked about the chin tusks in the gray animal. This one also has these big chin tusks. So it seems to be something that at least kind of regionally, we may be seeing some of these larger chin tusks in mastodons from this area. But the difference here is we have a short jaw. We don't have that long extended jaw. So this was a really interesting animal. And we had a student, the person who's also doing a lot of the art that I'm showing you in this presentation, Matt Inhabitant, did this for his thesis. And it was as much a historical story as it was a story about mastodons. So this one, it was difficult to date because it's beyond the range of radiocarbon, but we think that it's probably dates to this interglacial time period where it was tromping around South Carolina. North Carolina probably would have been very similar. It's much warmer at that time. We have things like the extension of alligator and tortoise ranges further north at that time. So the ice age isn't always cold. And so this is kind of a representative of that time. But the other place where we're doing a lot of work and kind of on the ground types work is in southwestern Virginia. And this is a classic paleontological site, quaternary paleontological site near Saltville, actually in Saltville. So if you travel to Saltville today, you may actually see Woolly, the mammoth. This is one of two mammoths that they have that they bring out for things like 4th of July parades. And they do have Mammoths Days in January where you can go up and pay your $5 for a pancake feed. But they have a great quaternary paleontological site basically in their backyard. It's called Saltville because historically it was really important for mining salt. Basically, people would pump a brine out of a Mississippian sediment that's down below the valley here and then dry out the brine. You'd have basically table salt. But in this case, we've been pumping down some of these ponds in the bottom of the valley and then excavating on the bottom. So this is us a couple of years ago working at Saltville, and we've got to actually have a pump off here to the side. This during the off season, this is a small pond that's about 6-8 feet deep on a good day. But we're actually excavating over here in the corner, and we found a lot of things in Saltville. The diversity is really quite incredible. This is just some of the pictures of things that are in situ. So in this one, we've got a lot of mastodon. So here's a mastodon tooth, a couple of mastodon teeth. Here's a toe bone, so a rib and some other things. And one of the really cool things about this site is the preservation is fantastic. And so these teeth, this particular tooth is dated to about 20,000 years ago. This one's dated to about 22,000 years ago. We've got short-faced bear, we've got sloth, we've got many other animals that are around. Let's see. And so this is kind of the timeline that we have. And so we have everything from greater than radiocarbon, so about 47,000 or greater than 47,000 up to about 20,000 years ago that's preserved in this gravel deposit. But then something happens at the valley scale. And rather than having gravel deposited, we have finer grained sediments. And then so we have the last end of the Pleistocene is really well preserved in some of these finer grained sediments. And so this is a really fantastic record for understanding the latest Pleistocene. One of the cool things about this is because we're in the middle of of town, and we have a very active local collaborator in the Middle Appalachian Museum of the Middle Appalachians that's in Saltville. And if you're ever there, I encourage you to stop by. They help us do a lot of education. So this is a dig outreach event that we do with kids. It's muddy, it's dirty, it's usually very hot. Sometimes it rains, but everybody always has fun. So you can kind of see this particular participant really had more fun rolling around in the mud than finding fossils. But Saltville has been fun for more than just finding fossils. It has actually been key to understanding the evolutionary timeline for mastodons. We've got really good preservation of biomolecules. So The reason that we can date them is because we're able to extract really good collagen out of them. And so we can date the collagen. We were also able to get really good DNA out of them. So this is a paper that comes from a paper that we did last year with a ancient DNA lab up at McMaster University in Canada, a guy named Emil Karpinski. And you can see this is the phylogenetic tree of mastodons. So we've got time along here on the bottom with about 3.5 million years over here at the left, and then 0 over at the right. And then each one of these lines is a different mastodon DNA strand. And we've got some animals from the Alaska and the Yukon that are kind of plotting out different. The Midwest and Northeast is plotting out a little bit different. And then we've got a number of other groups that are that split off from these two groups kind of really early on. In fact, some of the Mexican stuff is an estimated split of about 3 million years. So we're dealing with something that is really these animals, although they may not look very different in different places, they are genetically extremely different. And so this has been a lot of fun. One of the cool things about this is that the Saltville mastodons are popping out. We're getting DNA out of them. We're able to learn how these animals kind of change through time, and how the populations themselves are changing as part of this larger metapopulation within North America. And this, one of the cool things is the paleontology of mammoths and mastodons specifically in the last couple of years has really been changed by the ability to extract and analyze ancient DNA from their remains. In this case, one of the most productive ways forward, that all of these animals would be considered Mammut americanum. However, there's clearly something else going on with these things too. So the DNA is allowing us to kind of start teasing these things apart. And so now when we go into the field, we're immediately thinking, okay, how do we articulate, how do we integrate with what the ancient geneticists are also doing? So that's going to transition me a little bit to something entirely different. And this is what I've been working on this summer. In the southern Appalachian Mountains, we have these ecological niches that are called grassy balds, or these ecosystems that are called grassy balds. They are too high for some of the more deciduous trees and the deciduous forests that we see in the southeast, but they're too low for spruce and fir forests, and they're not above tree line. And the origins and how they're maintained is, I won't say it's an ecological mystery, because that infers that it's not something that we can answer, that we'll never know. I think that it is something that we can figure out how this works, but right now it's wonderfully complex. These grassy balds, if you've hiked the Appalachian Trail is famous for them. They're wonderful views. This is a view off of one that's near us called Roan Mountain. And basically, we've got spruce and fir kind of around the edges, and we've actually got some beech trees that are starting to encroach on the middle. But overall, it's dominated by grass and shrubs. And so these are really unique ecosystems that tend to be high up. And this is something that, many of you who knew Emily, she really got into this when she was here. And we were working in Saltville, and she said, we've got this grassy bald that's about 35 kilometers away, that ecologists have said the reason that this bald is here is because mammoths and mastodons went up there and grazed it down. So mammoths and mastodons were kind of called out as the bad guys for grazing away the forest and denuding the forest during the Pleistocene. And then as the Holocene came along and these ecosystems were starting to these were very slow to rebound, number one, but then also herbivores during the Holocene were kind of maintaining these grassy. Emily got really, really interested in this during her thesis work. And so this is, Emily up on White Top Mountain, which is one of the high grassy balds. And this is a snapshot of what she was doing, some of what she was doing for her thesis work. This is a map. but it's a special map. It's a map of the Saltville Valley, but it's a really special map because Saltville is basically in the middle. And then there's a 10-kilometer radius around here. But she was looking at basically chemical signatures that she could match in megafaunal teeth to spots on the landscape. So she was using strontium isotopes, and strontium isotopes, depending on the age of rock that's underneath you and the amount of weathering that's underneath you and that sort of thing, it really teases apart spatially. And so if you can look at changes in strontium isotopes in things that grow incrementally, like teeth or tusks or shell, you can see how an animal was moving across the landscape, because you can basically tie that snapshot of when that tooth was forming to the spot on the landscape that that animal was when that tooth was forming. And so this is something that I've been doing for many years. I started out doing it with bison. One of the take-home messages with bison, which was a surprise, is that bison before about 1800 did not migrate. And then when I started moving into mammoths and mastodons, we're finding that mammoths and mastodons, you know, we assumed, made a lot of assumptions about some of these basic kind of ecological behaviors that they might have had, like they would have had to migrate because they're just so big, and modern elephants migrate. In reality, we were finding that megafauna from Saltville were not migrating. They were basically hanging out in the bottoms. They were exhibiting strontium isotope values that are very similar to the valleys of Saltville and kind of that area, but they were not getting up onto the Blue Ridge and up into these grassy bald environments that would have had a very different strontium isotope value. So this was kind of how we got into this idea of grassy balds, and thinking, I'm trained as a archaeologist and as a paleontologist, vertebrate paleontologist, but this summer I have been thinking so much about vegetation community changes and that sort of thing, that it's been a lot of fun. So this is one of the pieces of research that we've really been pushing forward in the last couple of years, and expanding some of the places where we're sampling sediments for pollen. We're trying to understand really in more detail what's going on from a climate perspective and what's going on from a vegetation perspective here in the Southern Appalachians. So Schoolyard Springs in northeastern Tennessee is one that we're going to recore for pollen. It has a late Pleistocene pollen record. And then this is one of Emily's compatriots, a graduate student from ETSU, Austin Gauss, who's sampling some of the Saltville water for ostracods. So ostracods are tiny little crustaceans that you can give you very good pH and chemical indicators for lakes and streams and things like that. Last thing I'm going to touch on appropriately is extinction. And so obviously we don't have any mammoths and mastodons around anymore. And the Southeast does have a couple of dogs in the fight on what goes on to drive some of these animals extinct. And one of these is the Coates-Hines mastodons. There's 4 mastodons that are from the Nashville area. They were excavated starting in 1970. And there was always kind of this idea that there was this possible human association. There was artifacts that were more or less associated with these mastodons, but in recent years, reanalyses have not been able to kind of tighten up that association. Basically, it's a site with 4 mastodons in a 30,000-year-old pond that is surrounded by 3,000-year-old archaeological sites where there's a lot of kind of rain of artifacts on top. So the strength of those associations have not really withstood the test of time. So these are probably not animals that were killed by people, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore them. And this is one of those sites that we brought back to Gray and used our prep lab and our students to put back together. So this is what one of these humeri looks like put back together. This is a pretty good animal too. And because we have this humerus, we can get at, like Gray, we can get at a pretty good mass estimate for this thing, which is about 7.3 US tons, or about 3,700 chihuahuas. So, if you're trying to wrap your brain around tonnage, a chihuahua is not a bad metric. But one of the other things that we're trying to do is really go out and date these things. So these last extinctions are well within the range of radiocarbon. The problem in the southeast that we were finding, not a problem, it's a challenge, is that preservation is always an issue. And so here we've got, this is something I pulled together for a chapter in a book last year, but collagen dates, so things that we're able to extract collagen from a bone. These are very good dates. We're usually pretty confident in these dates. They're these black bars. Bioapatite is basically tooth enamel, or it's a mineral component of the bone. It's not a really great date. Oftentimes it skews young, sometimes really young. So a 30,000-year-old bone could actually be like 15,000 or 5,000 because it's really an open system with the sedimentary environment. But you can kind of see with our large animals, they're the ones here up at the top, greater than 100 kilograms. We've got some saber-toothed cat, Homotherium serum, that's going out at about 30,000 years ago. Short-faced bears are going out about 20,000. Hespero testudo, giant tortoise, latest dates on those are about 15,000. Then we get to Columbian mammoths and American mastodons. Our best date for American mastodon, well, the mammoths, we've got a good date at about 20,000 for Saltville. Saltville mammoths are really, really kind of interesting. They come in two kinds. We have a partial skeleton that is wonderfully preserved in one area of the site. And then everywhere else, they show up as just tiny little chewed up ends of their teeth. So their teeth that have basically gotten through the entire life cycle and then spit out the other end. And so those are basically the two ways that we have mammoths at Saltville. But they do date to about 20,000 years ago. We've got a kind of a poor date that's a little bit younger from Georgia. Mastodons, they get all the way up to about 14,000 years ago is our best dates for mastodons. So we are getting a kind of a late mastodon date. And then we've got some really young mammoth dates that are probably not great at the end here. So I'm going to kind of wrap things up there. This is, you know, the way going back to how paleontologists see landscapes. This is a shot of a grassy bald with some mastodon skeletons on. But this is, you know, these are things that we've been working on. A lot of them are in process, and you know, we're looking to expand out. We want to rope in things like the North Carolina mammoth and mastodon record, which is really kind of interesting. You guys have Gomphotheres here. You have a lot of your collections are in the Smithsonian and elsewhere, and I think they're probably pretty datable. But it's just a matter of putting in some of the legwork and doing it. So at this point, I'll take any questions you have, or I know you have a business meeting and I probably spoke a little bit long, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
So I encourage anybody who has a question to unmute themselves or to leave something in chat if you would prefer.
Hey, Chris, this is Linda McCall.
Hi, Linda.
I think I met you a while back when I went by Graves during Emily's tenure there. I think I was at a GSA conference or something. But anyway, I'm wondering, you don't show any Gomphothere on your maps. Were you just selectively doing mammoth and mastodon?
Mammoth and mastodon are our best records. We have more mammoth and mastodon than anything else. Gomphotheres, well, if mastodons are ignored, Gomphotheres have been forgotten. There's anywhere outside of Florida. So Gomphotheres, we do have them up into South Carolina, North Carolina. I know of at least a couple of North Carolina specimens that are in the Smithsonian, and certainly in the State Museum there, you've got some Gomphotheres. The thing with Gomphotheres is we just have no concept of when they get here or when they go extinct. So there are no dated specimens. Many of the ones that we do have, we haven't really chased down the localities to really understand, you know, how old is this record. And so I've kind of moved throughout my career. I've moved from mammoths. I started out with bison and then kind of moved to mammoths and spent a couple of years really trying to wrap my brain around mammoths. And then the last couple of years have been really derailed by mastodons. But someday it would be really fun to tackle Gomphotheres. There's right now there's there's a site being excavated in Florida called Mount Brook. It's a contemporary of gray, so it's a very similar time frame, but it's filled with Gomphotheres. They have one mastodon, but it's a young animal, and they're not quite sure. It looks more like some of their other Pliocene, Miocene mastodons. It doesn't look like gray. Gray looks weird. It's probably a new species, but yeah, that's Gomphotheres are still a mystery, but they don't need to be.
Well, if you ever just do derail yourself onto Gomphotheres, I'm aware that several of our members have picked up some Gomphothere from around here.
Ooh, that would be much fun. Yes.
Yeah, some teeth at least.
Yeah.
And then my second pronged question is, I noticed on your map you did not show any mastodon from Texas. Is that a new thing? Is that a true thing? Because I'm checking with my Texas people right now. I sent them an email and I'm waiting because I think I have seen mastodon from Texas, but I saw no dots on your map.
Yeah, they've got mastodons. It might have just been the crop on my map, but they're definitely mammoth land. I'll put it that way. There are more mammoths out in Texas than there are mastodons, and this is something that we learned. So before I came to Tennessee, when I was in Illinois, we had a big project where we basically did kind of a museum pub crawl throughout the Midwest, inventoried everybody's mammoth and mastodon collections, and then dated a whole bunch of them. And we learned a lot. We learned that mastodons don't like it cold, for instance. When the glaciers are at their further southernmost extent, you've got mammoths, but you don't have any mastodons in the Midwest. They also don't like it dry. So I think that with Texas, you're starting to get to the edge of that dry kind of ecological niche. And so they are out there. In fact, some of our best, largest sites with the most mastodons in them come from the Western US in what are now fairly dry environments. So Snowmass Village up in Colorado, it's high elevation, but I think there's 34 mastodons that came out of Snowmass Village. And that was, subject of a NOVA special and some Discovery Channel work a couple of years ago. If you go out to California, one of the major reservoirs that feeds LA is called Diamond Valley Lake. They also have a bunch of mastodons, and that's the collection that really was the type collection for describing the Pacific mastodon a couple of years ago. So they do exist out there, but when you get out into those open, dry environments, mammoths do much better.
Very much.
Yeah, Lynn?
I very much enjoyed your talk, learned so much, and thank you. Thank you for sharing with us, Chris. It was great.
My pleasure.
Yeah, Joy.
Chris, will you and your person be at our fossil fair?
I didn't catch that. You kind of went in and out.
I'm sorry. Will you attend our fossil fair in person?
I don't know. My life right now is very weird. I have 2 teenagers, and so it's fairly unpredictable. And then I'm also kind of, escorting graduate students through. So I try and make it to events like that because I enjoy them a lot. But a lot of times my time is not my own. But I'll definitely try and make it.
Pencil us in, it's November 6th.
I'll put it on the calendar for sure.
Yeah.
All right, anyone else?